The richest man in the market knelt down in the dust in front of the widow everyone mocked, took off his polished shoe, and set it in her cracked hands like an offering. Mama Aduni did not move. She sat on her low wooden stool behind her little cobbler's stall, the same stall they laughed at, a kerosene lamp still burning beside her, in the bright morning because she had worked through the night again. And she watched a man worth more than the whole of Balogun market bow his head to a woman who mended shoes for 200 naira a pair. The market went quiet, the way a market never goes quiet. The yam sellers stopped calling their prices. The girl frying akara 2 stalls down let the oil hiss alone. The same traders who, for 11 years, had called her Mama Lamp behind her back, who had laughed that only a foolish woman would ruin her eyes, stitching other people's worn-out souls by a lamp like somebody from the last century, now stood with their mouths open while the man in the white agbada knelt on their dusty floor and would not get up. He had arrived in a long black car, with 2 younger men in suits walking ahead of him to clear the way. People had assumed he was lost. Men like that did not come into the cobbler's row at the back of the market, where the gutters ran close and the stalls were patched with old zinc. He had walked past the phone case sellers and the belt sellers and the women selling second-hand shoes in great heaps, and he had stopped in front of the smallest, poorest stall of them all, the one with the hand-painted sign that simply read, "Shoes mended here." And he had looked at the small, gray-haired woman behind it, and his proud face had broken like a boy's. Mama Aduni Olawale was 58 years old. For 11 years, she had run this stall in the cobbler's row, and for 11 years, she had been the joke of it. She arrived before the gates opened at 5:30, while the city was still gray, and she set out her little tools on a square of clean cloth, her awls and her waxed thread, and her curved needles and her tin of black polish, and she laid down beside them the one thing she never sold, and never lent, and never let out of her sight, a worn, wooden-handled cobbler's awl, with a brass collar gone soft and golden from 40 years of one man's grip, then 40 years of hers. It had been her husband's. Tijani had been a master cobbler, the finest on the whole island, some said, and he had taught her everything he knew across the long evenings of their marriage. And when he died, 11 years ago now, with no son to take his bench, the men of the trade had assumed his widow would sell his tools and go and sit quietly somewhere and become old. She had not done that. She had taken his bench instead. They had laughed at her from the very first morning. A woman cobbler. The other men in the row, younger men with louder machines and brighter signs, had treated it as a small joke that would tire itself out in a month. When it did not, the joke grew teeth. They called her slow because she stitched by hand where they glued by machine. They called her stubborn because she would take a shoe apart fully, down to the last in the welt, when a faster man would have run a bead of glue around the sole and sent the customer away in 3 minutes. And they called her foolish, most of all, for the lamp. When the public power went, as it went most evenings, the younger men packed up and went home, because who could see to work in the dark? Mama Aduni lit her kerosene lamp, set it just so, on the corner of her bench, and kept stitching. Long after the row had emptied, long after the generators 2 streets over had gone silent, the small steady light of her lamp burned in the dark market, and the night watchman knew her by it. The woman who mended shoes by lamplight when everyone sensible had gone to bed. Here is the very thing this channel was built for. So let me say it to you plainly before we go on. If you have ever been the one who does the work properly, while louder people cut the corners and take the praise, If you have ever been quietly mocked for caring too much about doing a small thing well, for keeping at it honestly, long after the room has emptied and the easy money has gone home, then you already belong here with us under the Baobab. Take one moment to subscribe to Baobab Tales, because the quiet, careful, overlooked people are exactly the ones these stories are told for. And I do not want you to miss what was about to walk into that market and kneel in the dust. What none of them understood, what not one of the laughing men in that row had ever once stopped to ask, was why her hands would not let her hurry. It was not slowness. It was a thing Tijani had pressed into her, across 30 years, long before her hands could do it without her mind. A shoe carries a person through their whole life, he used to tell her, holding a worn soul up to the lamp and reading it the way another man reads a letter. Look, you can see where he stands too long. You can see where she favors the right knee. A shoe remembers everything about the one who wears it, and a man who mends shoes carelessly mends a lie into another person's every step. So you take it all the way apart, Aduni. You see the truth of it. You do not glue over a wound. Her hands had learned to do it the slow, honest way, and they kept doing it the slow, honest way, long after the man who taught her was gone, because the hands remembered him, even on the nights the heart was too tired to. And so, for 11 years, she had bent over other people's shoes by her small light and asked the world for nothing. And the world had given her exactly that, and laughed while it did. She raised her granddaughter Simi on what the stall brought in, 200 naira for a resolé, 50 to stitch a strap, 100 to save a heel, and Simi was 19 now, and in her first year of nursing school across the lagoon, and the money for that came stitch by stitch by stitch from this poor little stall. The whole market thought was a sad old woman's hobby, because the man in the white agbada had not come by accident, and he had not come for himself. His name was Sunday Bankole, and there was perhaps no name better known in Lagos that year. He had built, from nothing the newspapers loved to say, the largest indigenous logistics company in the country, a fleet of trucks and a ring of warehouses that moved goods from the ports to the markets of half the nation. He had begun, the same newspapers said, as a poor boy from Mushin, with one good idea and a great deal of nerve. He was on the radio. He was on the great billboards along the expressway. And on this particular morning, he had been the guest of honor at a foundation event 3 streets away, where they were naming a new wing of a children's hospital after his late mother, and the whole of the city's powerful had gathered to watch him cut the ribbon. He had been due to give a speech. Instead, he had walked out in the middle of the program, gotten into his car, and told his stunned driver to take him into the market, to the cobbler's row at the very back, and to drive slowly, because he was looking for someone, and he was not at all sure she would still be there. To understand why a man like that would do such a thing, you have to go back 22 years to a night Sunday Bankole had never once told a journalist about, because it was the most important night of his life, and it belonged to no one but him and a woman whose name, until very recently, he had not even known. 22 years before, Sunday Bankole had been a young man of 26 with nothing. His one idea had earned him exactly one chance, a single meeting with a man who controlled a fleet of trucks, a man who might lend a serious sum to a young nobody if, and only if, that young nobody could convince him in one short conversation that he was serious, careful, a man who finished what he started. The meeting was at 8 the next morning on the island, in an office with marble floors. And Sunday Bankole owned one suit, borrowed, and one pair of leather shoes, his late father's only good shoes. the shoes the old man had been buried, having worn to every job interview of his own hard life, and the night before that one meeting that would decide everything, the right sole of those shoes had torn clean away from the upper. He had stood under a flickering streetlight near the market, turning the ruined shoe over in his hands, and he had felt his one chance dissolving, because a man cannot walk into a marble office to ask for millions with his father's shoe flapping open and his sock showing through, and every cobbler in the city had long since shut for the night. He had walked the dark streets half mad with it, and at the very back of the closed-up market, he had seen, alone in all that darkness, one small, steady light. A woman was working by a kerosene lamp at a cobbler's stall. A young woman then, not yet 40, bent over a shoe with a curved needle, and she had looked up at the desperate young man standing there, with his broken shoe and his wild eyes, and she had not laughed, and she had not turned him away, though the hour was late and her own day had been long. She had told him to sit. He had confessed he had almost no money, only a few coins, nothing near the price of the work. She had looked at the shoe, and then at his face, and she had said something he would carry for the rest of his life. She had said, "These were a serious man's shoes. Let us make sure they carry a serious man one more time." If you've made it this far into Mama Aduni's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She had not glued it. He remembered that even now, in his fine office, more than 20 years on. A lesser hand would have run a line of glue around the torn sole, pressed it shut, taken his few coins and sent him into the night, and the glue would have held perhaps a week. Instead, the woman at the lamp had taken his father's shoe fully apart at the sole, frowning at it, reading it, and she had told him quietly that the shoe had torn because the old stitching had rotted through, not because the leather was finished, and that a proper job would last him years, not days. She had restitched the whole sole by hand, by the light of her lamp, while he sat on an upturned crate beside her and watched her work and slowly stopped shaking. It had taken her most of 2 hours. When she was done, the shoe was sounder than it had been in a decade. He had pressed all the coins he had into her hand and begged her to take them, and she had taken only a few. The price of the thread, she said, and folded the rest back into his palm and closed his fingers over it, and told him to keep it because a man going to ask for his future should not arrive with empty pockets. He had worn his father's mended shoes into that marble office the next morning at 8 o'clock, and he had stood straight in them, and something about standing straight in his father's sound shoes had let him speak like the serious man he meant to become. He had gotten the loan. He had built, on the foundation of that one morning, everything. Everything. The trucks, the warehouses, the billboards, the wing of the hospital with his mother's name going up on it in steel letters even now, 3 streets away, while he knelt in the dust. And in 22 years of telling and retelling the story of how he began, he had left out the one part that mattered most, not out of shame, but because for 22 years he had not known her name, had never been able to find again the small dark stall, and the woman at the lamp had begun in time to wonder whether he had dreamed her. He had searched in his quiet way for years. He had sent people to the market more than once to ask after a woman who mended shoes by lamplight, and they had come back with nothing, because they had asked among the loud, successful cobblers of the front rows, and no one there counted the poor old woman at the back as one of them worth mentioning. The trail had gone cold. He had made his peace, almost, with never thanking her. And then, 2 weeks before that morning, his elderly aunt had needed a particular pair of shoes mended. an old and treasured pair, and a girl who cleaned in his aunt's house, a quiet nursing student who worked weekends to pay her fees, had said she knew exactly the person. The only person in Lagos who still did such work properly, by hand, the slow, honest way. My grandmother, the girl had said, she mends shoes at the market. People laugh at her because she still works by a lamp when the power goes. But she is the best there is. My grandfather taught her. He was a master. Sunday Bankhole had gone very still. He had asked the girl, carefully, how long her grandmother had kept that stall. 11 years on her own, the girl said, and before that she worked beside my grandfather for 30. He had asked the girl her grandmother's name. Aduni, the girl said. Aduni Olawale. He had asked, his voice strange now, whether her grandmother had ever, long ago, mended a pair of shoes late at night for a young man with no money, the night before some important thing. And the girl had laughed gently and said, Sir, my grandmother has done that more times than anyone could count. She has never once turned away a person in trouble at her lamp. Not in all my life, no matter the hour, no matter the money. It is the thing the other traders mock her for the most. That was when he had known, not from one detail, but from all of them. The lamp. The slow, honest hand. The refusal to turn a desperate stranger away in the dark. The master who taught her. The woman he had searched for, and half stopped believing in, had been there the whole time, in plain sight at the back of the same market, mocked for the very kindness that had once saved his entire life, while 3 streets away, they prepared to carve his success into the side of a hospital. He had wanted, his first wild thought, to send for her, to have his people bring her to him. And then he had understood that to do it that way would be to repeat the very thing the world had done to her for 11 years. To make the small woman come to the big man, to keep her at the back, while the powerful sat at the front. No. If he owed this woman his entire life, and he did, then he would go to her, into her place, among the people who had laughed, and he would do it in front of all of them, so that the laughing would have to stop. So he had walked out of his own honoring. He had left the marble and the cameras and the dignitaries waiting, and he had ridden into the market, and he had found the smallest stall in the cobbler's row, and the gray-haired woman behind it, and the kerosene lamp still burning beside her in the daylight, because she had worked through another night and his proud face had broken, and he had knelt. Mama Aduni did not know any of this yet. She knew only that a very wealthy stranger had knelt in front of her stall and taken off his shoe and was holding it out to her with both hands, and that his eyes were full. She thought, in her practical way, that the great man had perhaps torn his soul and been told by someone that the old woman at the back could fix anything, and she reached out by long habit to take the shoe and see what was wrong with it. But the man held on to it a moment, and he spoke, and the whole silent market heard him. He said, "Mama, you will not remember me. There is no reason you should. But 22 years ago, on a night when I had nothing in the world but a broken pair of my dead father's shoes and one chance I was about to lose, I came to your lamp, and you sat me down, and you told me these were a serious man's shoes, and you would make sure they carried a serious man one more time. And you mended them by hand, by your lamp, for almost nothing, and you put the money back in my hand, and told me not to go and ask for my future with empty pockets. And I went. Mama, I went the next morning in the shoes you mended, and everything I have, everything they are putting my name on 3 streets from here this very morning, every truck and every building and every naira of it, I have because a woman, The whole of this market calls a fool. Sat in the dark when everyone else had gone home, and refused to do a careless job, and refused to turn a desperate boy away. The market did not breathe. She remembered, not the man, there had been so many over the years, but the night, one of 100 such nights. A frightened young one with a torn shoe and wild eyes, and her own voice saying the thing about serious men's shoes that she had said in some form to so many. Her hand had gone to her mouth, and the man, still kneeling, had turned then, and spoken not to her, but to the row, to all the traders standing frozen around them, and he had said, loudly, so that the whole back of the market and a good part of the front could hear it. I have built one of the largest companies in this country, and I have stood on stages and been called a self-made man, and it is not true. This woman made me. Her hands, her honesty, her lamp. You have laughed at her for 11 years. I have come here today to tell you that you have been laughing at the finest person in this entire market, and that I owe her everything, and that I will spend a good part of what she helped me build, making sure the whole city knows her name. That was the moment the laughing died for good. You could see it go out of their faces one by one, the yam seller and the Akara girl, and the loud young cobblers, with their bright signs, as they understood that the woman they had mocked for sitting in the dark had quietly, in that very dark, with her own hands, set a great man on his road, and had never once mentioned it. Not in 11 years, not when they laughed, because to her it had not been a great deed. It had only been a Tuesday night, and a young one in trouble, and the only honest way to mend a shoe. But the kneeling and the speech were not the whole of why he had come, and the truest part of that morning was still to come, and it had to do with a second pair of shoes, and with a letter, and with a man who had been 22 years in his grave, when his own broken shoe had been mended that long ago night. Sunday Bankole had asked the young cobbler woman her husband's name, the master whose tools she worked with, and she had told him, Tijani Olawale. Years later, grown rich, Sunday had gone looking for that name out of gratitude, and had found that the master cobbler Tijani Olawale was already dead, and that the man had been, in his own small trade, a kind of quiet legend, the cobbler the other cobblers brought their hardest jobs to, the man who could rebuild a shoe everyone else had given up on, and Sunday, who collected fine and difficult things now, had over the years quietly bought, from a dealer in such curiosities, a single remarkable pair of shoes, known to have been the last great work of the master Tijani Olawale, a pair the old man had built entirely by hand in the final year of his life, for a client who had then died before collecting them, so that they had passed from hand to hand, unworn, a small perfect masterpiece of a vanished craft. Sunday Bankole had owned those shoes for 6 years, without ever once realizing that the woman who had saved his life and the widow of the man who had made his most treasured possession were one and the same person, until the nursing student cleaning his aunt's house said her grandfather's name out loud, and the whole impossible circle had closed in an instant in his chest. He had brought the shoes with him. One of the young men in suits stepped forward now, and placed into the chief's hands a soft cloth bag, and from it Sunday Bankole drew out a pair of shoes, such as the row had not seen in many years. Hand-stitched, the leather deep and living, the welt as fine as a thing could be made, and he placed them gently on the clean cloth of Mama Aduni's bench, beside her tools, beside the worn awl with the soft brass collar. And he watched her face. She looked at the shoes, and she went absolutely still, the way a person goes still in front of something that holds a ghost, because she knew that stitching. She knew it the way you know a voice in the dark. She had watched those very hands make that very welt across 30 years of evenings, and she whispered her husband's name, Tijani, and put out one shaking finger and touched the leather as if it might not be real. "These are his," she said. "These are Tijani's hands." Where? She could not finish it, and Sunday Bankole told her, kneeling there, that he had owned this pair for 6 years, the last work of a master, and had never known until 2 weeks ago that the master was her husband, that the very hands that had built the most beautiful thing he owned had also, through her, the wife those hands had taught, reached out one dark night and mended a broken shoe for a desperate boy and changed the course of his whole life. 2 gifts from the same source, he said, 22 years apart, and I never knew, until your granddaughter said his name, that they came from the same 2 people. The shoes are yours, Mama. They were always going to come home to you. I am only the one who got to carry them back. It was then that the granddaughter herself came running. Simi had finished her morning class across the lagoon, and the message had reached her in a dozen frantic forms. Your grandmother, the market, the big man, come. And she came pushing through the gathered crowd in her nursing school uniform, frightened half to death, and stopped dead at the sight of the chief kneeling and her grandmother weeping over a pair of shoes. And it was Simi who, understanding all at once what had happened, the man she cleaned for, the grandfather she had bragged about, knelt down beside her grandmother in the dust and held the old woman while she shook. There was something else in the cloth bag. Folded inside it, against the shoes, was an envelope, old, the paper gone soft, and Sunday Bankole handed it to Mama Aduni with both hands, and told her he had found it tucked into the lining of the left shoe when he first bought the pair 6 years before, and had kept it, not knowing what it was, or to whom it might one day matter. On the front, in a hand she had not seen in 11 years, in her husband's small, careful writing, were the words, "For whoever finishes the journey, these shoes begin." Her hands shook so hard that Simi had to help her open it. It was not long. Tijani had written it, the date showed, in the last month of his life, the year he made these final shoes, when he must already have known he was leaving. "The hand you have hired to make these shoes," he had written, "is finishing its work, and so, I think, am I. I have spent my life mending the shoes of people who walk roads I will never see, and I have come to believe a man's whole life is in his shoes, where he has stood, where he has stumbled, how far he still means to go. I do not know who will wear this last pair, but I know my craft outlives me, in good shoes that will carry strangers, and in one pair of hands I taught better than I taught my own, my wife's hands, Aduni's hands, which are finer than mine ever were, though she will never believe it. If you, who read this, ever meet a woman who mends shoes by lamplight, careful and slow and kind to the desperate, that is the one I mean. Tell her the old man said she always was the better cobbler. Tell her the lamp was never foolishness. Tell her a light kept burning for honest work in the dark is the most serious thing a person can do. Mama Aduni wept then in a way the market had never seen her weep in 11 years, not at the firing of any cruelty, but at a tenderness 22 years in the carrying. Her husband's voice, reaching her at last through the lining of a stranger's shoe, through the mouth of a man he had never met, telling her the one thing she had needed, and never once been given in all those mocked and lamplit years, that she had been right, that the slow, honest way had been right, that she always was the better cobbler. She did not gloat. There was no triumph turned outward at the traitors who had laughed. "No, I told you." so flung at the row. That was not in her, and it had never been the point. She sat on her low stool, with her husband's last shoes on her lap, and her granddaughter's arms around her, and the great man still kneeling in front of her. And she read the letter through twice. And then she folded it along its soft creases and held it to her chest. And she looked up at the man she had once mended a shoe for in the dark. And all she said, in her quiet way, was, "Then it was not for nothing." The lamp was not for nothing. What Sunday Bankole did after that, he did fully, and he did in the open, the way he had done everything that morning. He did not hand the old woman a check and drive away, which would have been the easy thing and the lesser thing. He stood at last, and he helped her to her feet. And he asked her, in front of the whole market, whether she would do him the honor of letting him build, with her, in her name, a proper place, a true workshop, where the slow, honest craft her husband had perfected, and she had carried could be taught to young people who had no other road, the way the trade had once had no road for a widow, and made one anyway. A school of the old craft, with her at the head of it. Aduni's hands teaching other hands the thing the market had laughed at, so that the lamp would not go out when she did. And the children's hospital wing they were naming after his mother that morning, he said, would have beside it, he would see to it, a small bursary in the name of Tijani Olawale, master cobbler, for the granddaughter, and for others like her, students working their way through with their hands, so that no clever young one would ever again have to choose between an education and an honest day's pay. It did not happen all at once. These things never do, but it happened. By the end of that year, the smallest stall in the cobbler's row was gone, and in its place, 2 streets over, in a clean, bright building with good light and many windows, so that no one would ever again have to work by a single lamp in the dark, the Olawale workshop opened its doors, and Mama Aduni sat at the head of a long bench with a dozen young people on either side of her, and she taught them the way her husband had taught her, slowly, honestly, all the way down to the truth of the shoe, no glue over a wound. She hung her husband's last shoes in a glass case on the main wall, where every young hand that entered could see them, and the collector's price they were worth she never once spoke of, because some things are not for selling, they are for proving every day that you came from somewhere true. The young cobblers of the old front row, the ones who had laughed loudest, were quiet now when they passed the new workshop, and some of them, the better ones, came humbly, in time to ask the old woman to teach them too, the proper hand-stitching. They had glued their way around for years, and she taught them as well, without a word about the laughing, because that was not in her either. Simi finished her nursing degree on the Tijani Olawale bursary, and qualified, and still came on Saturdays to keep her grandmother's accounts, because the old woman's hands, she said laughing, were a holy and a sacred thing, but her record-keeping was a disaster. And Sunday Bankole came too, now and then, quietly, with no cameras, and sat on a stool in the bright workshop, the way he had once sat on an upturned crate in the dark, and watched the old woman's hands move across the leather, and was, for an hour, a young man with nothing again, kept from ruin by a light somebody refused to put out. There was an evening near the end of that first year, the workshop emptied of its students, the great city going gold, and then violet outside the many windows, when Mama Aduni stayed late alone, as she had stayed late alone for so many thousands of nights. She took down her husband's last shoes from their glass case and held them in her lap, and she took up her old worn awl with the brass collar gone soft and golden. Under 40 years of his grip, and 11 of hers, and she ran her thumb along it the way he used to. She was 58 years old, the same age, give or take, that Tijani had been when he first taught her to read a soul by lamplight. She thought about the laughing, and about how very little, in the end, it had finally come to weigh. And she thought that a woman who was willing to be called a fool for the simple sin of doing honest work in the dark can sit unthanked and mocked for 11 long years and still turn out to have been, the whole time, the most important person in the market, the one quiet light that a whole life had walked toward without anyone seeing. She wrapped the shoes and set them back in their case. Then she did the thing she had done every working night of her life. She trimmed the wick of the old kerosene lamp, the very one, and even with all the bright electric light the new workshop now had, she lit it, just for a moment, alone, and let it burn beside her on the bench, a small, steady flame in the gathering dark, and she sat with it, and with her husband, and with the long proof of her hands. So here is what I would leave with you tonight, before the light goes. The world will always be quicker to honor the man on the stage than the woman in the dark who put him there, and quicker to laugh at the one who keeps a lamp burning for honest work than to ask what that light is for. But a good thing done quietly, with no thought of thanks, has a way of walking out into the world on its own 2 feet and coming home, years later, to kneel at your stall. So I will ask you this, and I will be reading every answer. If you had been Mama Aduni, mocked for 11 years, for a kindness no one remembered, would you have kept the lamp burning anyway? Doing the honest work in the dark, with no promise that anyone would ever see? Or would you have let it go out and joined the easier, louder world that laughed? Tell me honestly which one of those 2 people you are, the one who keeps the lamp or the one who lets it go dark.